Lebanon, the most dangerous place on earth. A land torn apart by religious and political differences, for generations engulfed by bitter civil war. Once the pearl of the Middle East, now the violent vortex of regional conflict. In the 1970s, into the Lebanese countryside came the Palestinian army, determined to destroy Israel. From Lebanon, the PLO waged a campaign of terror and destruction against Israel. Israel, in turn, launched counterstrikes, further tearing at the fragile fabric of Lebanon. In 1982, Israel decided to finish the PLO once and for all. This is the story of Israel's invasion of Lebanon, of an attempt to obliterate a dangerous enemy, of the bloody conquest of Beirut, of the innocent civilians caught tragically in the middle, and of the horrible price paid when Israel changed from David to Goliath. Through it all, ABC News was there. Watch now the original ABC News broadcasts of a great TV news story. Israel versus the PLO, the invasion of Lebanon. From ABC News, great TV news stories with Peter Jennings, Sam Donaldson, Barbara Walters, Geraldo Rivera, Frank Reynolds, Richard Threlkeld, Pierre Salinger, John Scally, and the worldwide resources of ABC News.
ABC News has learned that Israeli armed forces have completed preparations for a military attack into Lebanon, and U.S. officials believe will strike within a few days, probably this weekend. High administration officials have been alerted that Prime Minister Begin is on the brink of giving his forces a go-ahead, using as an explanation the assassination of an Israeli diplomat in Paris last Saturday. However, it's suspected at the highest level here that an Israeli decision to attack is time to take advantage of the U.S. preoccupation with the Falkland Islands crisis. At least 2 Israeli divisions have been spotted by U.S. satellite and other intelligence poised for an attack along the Lebanese border. Their position could foreshadow either the long-feared massive attack or a smaller invasion which would aim only at PLO installations in southern Lebanon. If the larger attack develops, some U.S. officials believe Israeli troops would seek to advance all the way to Beirut's outskirts while simultaneously attacking Syrian missiles positioned in the Bekaa Valley.
Good evening. The stillness of the ceasefire in southern Lebanon was shattered today by the sound of guns, bombs, and planes. Peter Jennings is at our foreign desk in London. Peter?
Frank, this afternoon the Israeli Air Force attacked a variety of targets in Lebanon. It wasn't the massive raid which much of the world has been expecting and which the United States has been trying to prevent. It was, however, an attack with major political implications. In the first of 2 reports, here is ABC Jacques Grenier in Beirut.
The Israeli jets flew over Lebanon for about 2 hours, concentrating their attacks on 4 Palestinian positions. The Palestinians responded with anti-aircraft guns and heat-seeking surface-to-air missiles. But the planes were too high for the guns and dropped decoy flares to attract the missiles. Lebanese radio said the Israeli bombs and rockets killed at least 25 people. Many more were wounded. Ambulances carried the casualties to Beirut, about 10 miles from the most intensive bombing. The rockets and bombs fell, for the most part, on Palestinian military positions. Reporters were kept away. The raids put to rest the American-negotiated ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinians, which has held tenuously for the past 9 months. Palestinian spokesman tonight made that very clear.
Everybody around the world knows that this is a clear provocation and it's a violation and a breaching to the ceasefire which was agreed upon.
For several weeks now, Palestinian leaders have been predicting that Israel will invade southern Lebanon. Any retaliation by the Palestinians for today's air raids could provoke that very invasion. Jacques Grenier, ABC News, Beirut.
It's been a long time now that people on both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian divide have been waiting for an incident, something that would generate open conflict again between Israel and the Palestinians in Lebanon. That incident, the Israelis blame it on the PLO denied it, was a terrorist attack on Israel's ambassador in Britain last night. Within 24 hours, Israel and the Palestinians were attacking each other across the Israeli-Lebanese border. First, from Beirut, here's ABC's Chris Harper.
The Israeli attack was centered on Palestinian positions in Beirut, leaving over 30 people dead and scores injured. One key target was a sports arena, where Israel claimed the PLO was storing its weapons. Eyewitnesses say at least 10 waves of Israeli jets pounded refugee camps and the area near the main headquarters of the PLO. It was the third and most damaging raid in the past 6 weeks, while Israel said the hour-long raid was in retaliation for the shooting of its ambassador to Britain. The PLO denied that its people were involved in that attack. The PLO responded with anti-aircraft fire as the jets swooped down on Beirut and later sent Katyusha rockets pouring on Israeli settlements along the border. Ambulances screamed throughout Beirut, carrying dead and wounded to nearby hospitals. The PLO puts the casualties at 35 dead, but the toll is expected to rise as victims are found in the rubble. The PLO poured smoke bombs throughout the city to camouflage targets after the initial assault, and Palestinian gunmen seem prepared for another round, despite the 10-month-old truce here in Lebanon.
Today's attack shatters the truce between Israel and the Palestinians. When U.S. envoy Philip Habib arrives here next week, he will have to try to put together whatever pieces remain of that ceasefire. Chris Harper, ABC News, Beirut.
This is Bill Siemens in Israel. Almost immediately after the Israeli airstrike, Palestinian rockets and artillery shells fired from Lebanon into northern Israel damaged buildings, killed one Israeli, and wounded at least 4 others. It was the PLO answer to the Israeli air raid. As loudspeaker cars and troops urged residents to go down into their bomb shelters, Israeli artillery fired back, and tonight there seemed to be little hope for the ceasefire as the level of violence rises. The Israelis have repeatedly warned that they will not tolerate attacks like this at home, and they claim that they are now facing a new wave of terrorism against their diplomats abroad. The critical question tonight is whether the Israelis will now launch a ground attack against the PLO in Lebanon, less than 3 weeks before Prime Minister Begin is scheduled to meet President Reagan in Washington. Bill Siemens, ABC News, Tel Aviv.
Good evening from Versailles. The ornate palace outside Paris, where the end of the seven-nation economic summit today was completely overshadowed by an Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Israeli tanks and troops, backed by air and sea bombardment, crossed into Lebanon before dawn. The aim to destroy Palestinian guerrilla bases. And although hope was being expressed everywhere that there be no contact between the Israeli force and the Syrian force stationed in Lebanon, there is a report from Beirut tonight from the Syrian command that there has been a contact between Israeli and Syrian soldiers. We have 2 reports on the early fighting, beginning with Chris Harper in Beirut.
Warplanes pounded Palestinian targets in Lebanon again today as Israel launched a full-scale invasion against the PLO. The Palestinians say they downed 3 Israeli jets and 1 helicopter in the fighting and put more than 12 tanks out of commission. Early this morning, over 300 Israeli tanks and personnel carriers poured through UN peacekeeping forces, launching a 3-pronged attack on PLO strongholds in Tyre, Nabatea, and Shabaa. The aim of the invasion was to push the PLO farther north to stop missile attacks into Israel. In Sidon, the Palestinians celebrated the death of 1 Israeli pilot shot down during the massive airstrikes. The body was shown to angry mobs in the city. The PLO claims that 3 other pilots were killed and 1 captured in the fighting, the fiercest since Israel launched a similar invasion 4 years ago. The airstrikes continued for the 3rd day in a row as casualties mounted on both sides. Over 300 people have died so far here, and there are fears that the toll will be even higher as the Israelis push north. But the PLO holds strong positions in southern Lebanon, and many observers here think that Israel will suffer heavy losses, even if they are successful in their objectives. Chris Harper, ABC News, Beirut.
This is Bill Siemens in Israel. Long columns of Israeli tanks and armored personnel carriers loaded with infantry rolled over the border into southern Lebanon this morning. The Israeli military spokesman said that they would seek out and destroy all the Palestinian terrorist concentrations and artillery positions that have sent a rain of rockets and shells into Israeli border communities in the past few days. The shooting of the Israeli ambassador in London and the recent Palestinian shelling of northern Israel were the last straw. Moshe Ahrens, the Israeli ambassador to Washington, said today on the program This Week with David Brinkley that this operation would eliminate the problem.
Well, the Israeli army has moved into southern Lebanon. It has a clear-cut, single mission, namely pushing the PLO forces out of artillery range of Israeli settlements and towns in northern Israel, so that we can get the people, the women, the children, out of the shelters. Israel, of course, has no claim on a single square inch of Lebanese territory. Israel will do everything possible to avoid engagements or hostilities with the Syrian army. The Israeli government has announced that. It has that one single mission, and that is to get the PLO out of artillery and rocket range of northern Israel.
While these troops went into battle, the Israelis said they lost one Skyhawk jet fighter and one helicopter gunship, but admitted to no other losses. Prime Minister Begin received the support of opposition leader Shimon Peres, thus has a national consensus for the Israeli attack on the PLO. President Reagan, in a letter, urged Begin to keep a cool head and not let the fighting spread. Begin replied that he hoped that President Reagan understood Israel's position. Tonight, that position is clear: to destroy the PLO military force in Lebanon once and for all. Bill Siemens, ABC News in Israel.
The Israeli invasion of Lebanon has been deep and wide. It encompasses an area slightly smaller than Delaware and about a third larger than Rhode Island. By general estimates, the Palestinians are outnumbered 5-1. And as the PLO itself says, Israeli firepower is overwhelming. On the ground, across a front about 40 miles wide, Israeli armor has pushed north and east to the town of Hasbaya. In a central sector, they've attacked and captured the market town of Nabatea. And nearby, they've taken the strategic Palestinian fighting position at Beaufort Castle. Along the Mediterranean coast, the ancient city of Tyre, according to the Israelis, has been captured. And farther north, about halfway from the border to Beirut, an Israeli amphibious landing was made north of Sidon. Clearly, the Israeli intention is to cut off any Palestinian withdrawal. We have reports from both sides of the battle lines. That from Israel has been censored. Here is ABC's Hillary Brown tonight in the Israeli-occupied town of Nabatea.
For the past 24 hours, the Israelis have been pounding the Palestinians in their former stronghold of Nabatea, firing from positions high above the town. By mid-afternoon, they had flushed out all but a few of the terrorists. As the Israeli tanks rolled in, the villagers greeted them with flowers. The Palestinians were getting to be too much for us, one told me. They said that most of the terrorists had fled, leaving their dead behind. The town itself was in ruins after what people said was 3 straight days of shelling and aerial bombardment. This afternoon, refugees began to stream northward towards Sidon. That will not help them much. This afternoon, the Israeli Defense Ministry announced that it had landed this amphibious force north of Sidon, including tanks, APCs, and paratroopers, to encircle the town and block PLO escape routes to Beirut. In Jerusalem, Prime Minister Begin met U.S. Envoy Philip Habib this afternoon to discuss the situation. Habib intensely worried that it could get out of hand. Israeli officials said Habib was kept waiting until the facts on the ground suited Israel. And the Israelis continue to send more troops and supplies into South Lebanon. The massive amounts of arms and armor moved over the past 24 hours has raised fears that the Israelis could clash with some of the 30,000 Syrian troops based in Lebanon.
Hillary Brown, ABC News, with Israeli forces in South Lebanon.
This is Chris Harper in Beirut. Israeli warplanes pounded the area around the headquarters of the PLO in central Beirut today, leaving scores of people dead and wounded. As anger over the Israeli invasion mounted, unidentified gunmen fired rockets at the American embassy here. There were no injuries, but the staff of 50 people is now being cut substantially. The PLO says resistance on all fronts is continuing, but it is clear that the Palestinians are seriously outgunned. Israeli boats shelled the coastal roads to stop supplies from reaching the PLO, sending refugees fleeing from the no-man's land. In the air, the Israelis poured their planes into the skies over Lebanon again today. At least 2 Israeli pilots were shot down in a hail of anti-aircraft fire.
I'm not afraid, and you can see me. I have been treated well.
Syria put up some of its jets to battle the Israelis and also lost several soldiers in artillery duels, raising fears that the fight here may get even worse. It is obvious that the Israelis are going to continue to bomb here in Lebanon until they reach their objectives, and the PLO is bracing for a long battle. Chris Harper, ABC News, outside Beirut.
To say that war in Lebanon has intensified is to very much understate developments. Israel says today it shot down 22 Syrian fighter planes in aerial combat and lost none of its own. Syria admits it lost 16 of its Soviet-made aircraft, but adds that it shot down 19 Israeli fighter bombers. Whichever claim turns out to be accurate, there have been increasingly violent encounters between Israel and Syria. Both sides agree that in eastern Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, Israel made a massive attack on Syria's missile positions. Israel says they were all destroyed. On the Mediterranean coast, Israel has now captured yet another Lebanese town, Damour, once a Palestinian stronghold just south of Beirut. There are any number of unconfirmed reports, one of which is that Israeli forces are in the outskirts of Beirut, a capital living on little more than raw nerves. Our first report from the region comes from ABC's Bill Siemens, who's in Israel.
Israeli artillery also pounded the Bekaa Valley Syrian positions. The firing continued all day long, while overhead there were fleeting flashes of Syrian MiGs and Israeli F-15s dueling in the big air battle that tore through the skies. Defense Minister Sharon said the victory marked a turning point because the entire Syrian anti-aircraft missile system in the Bekaa Valley was destroyed, and now the way is cleared to attack the PLO positions that were being protected by the Syrian missiles. While the battles raged, the Israelis continued pouring long convoys of armored forces into Lebanon. Hour after hour, the tanks and armored personnel carriers rolled in, a force so strong that it was obviously intended to cope with the Syrian army, not only the PLO. Elsewhere, this is the first look at the mopping up operations in the coastal town of Sidon, which was regional PLO headquarters. These Palestinian prisoners were taken as the Israelis continued rooting out the die-hard defenders in tough house-to-house fighting. North of Sidon, the Israelis have captured Damour, just 10 miles from Beirut, and Arab sources claim some Israeli troops are only 2 miles from Beirut airport, increasing the expectation that they may attack PLO centers in Beirut itself. In the central sector, the Syrians say they are clashing with Israelis at Ain Bara, overlooking the strategic Beirut-Damascus highway in a position to cut off the Syrian troops around Beirut. Today, the cost of all this was evident as the funerals were being held. The Israelis say they have lost 32 dead so far, and there are 144 wounded. Trying to stop it all, American mediator Philip Habib met again with Prime Minister Begin and took Begin's appeal to avoid war to President Assad in Damascus. Meanwhile, as the Israeli convoys rolled through the night to build up their forces in Lebanon, reserves are being called up to strengthen Israeli positions facing the Syrians on the Golan Heights. And so tonight, the Israeli mission has gone beyond wiping out the PLO. They are now creating new facts, as the Israelis like to say, creating a new political and military situation in Lebanon aimed at getting rid of the Syrian army and restoring sovereignty to the Lebanese government. Bill Siemens, ABC News, Tel Aviv.
Lebanon long ago suffered a nervous breakdown. Now a great many observers believe Israel may be bent on altering its political balance forever, encouraging a new state dominated by right-wing Christians. Israel's land offensives in both the eastern and central sectors are cutting off Syrian forces from their homeland and have put Israel in position to link up with Lebanon's right-wing Christian militias, which are as determined as Israel to crush the Palestinians and drive the Syrian forces out. It's ironic that in 1976, Syria intervened in Lebanon's civil war to protect the then weak Christians against the Palestinians and the leftist Lebanese. Israelis speak of re-establishing a sovereign government in Lebanon, but the Christians are the most powerful now, with Israeli support, and have little interest in sharing power with the majority Muslims. In Lebanon, the failure to share power equitably has always been a recipe for disaster, and it has never led to a more secure Israel. Despite the president's call for Israel to stop the fighting in Lebanon, it is as fierce as ever. The Israelis, who still have the initiative, continue to fight with both Palestinians and Syrians. Israel says today it shot down at least 25 more Syrian fighter planes and 2 combat helicopters. Israel says it's now shot down at least 61 Syrian planes since the invasion began. Independent verification in such a situation is virtually impossible. Syria has not made a statement on losses, but says that Israel has been bombing civilians during what it calls a three-pronged attack into the Bekaa Valley along the Syrian-Lebanese frontier. The Syrian president, Hafez al-Assad, says Israel cannot be allowed to control Lebanon. Israel continues to push its offensive in the center of the country, and on the western Mediterranean side, Israel has been bombing Beirut, the capital. The PLO says 10,000 civilians have been killed or wounded since the invasion. It doesn't say how that figure was arrived at. Israel says it's achieved most of its war aims. Tonight, Israel has never been closer to nor more in control of an Arab capital. Israeli forces have completely sealed West and South Beirut, and by doing so, they say, 6,000 Palestinian fighters have been trapped. So have thousands of civilians. And Lebanon's presidential palace at Babda on the southeastern rim of the city is under virtual Israeli control, as is the headquarters of the Lebanese army. The Israelis have linked up with their right-wing Christian allies, and to the west, on the edge of the sea, they have now captured Beirut's international airport. Our first report is from ABC's Bill Siemens. As he is based in Israel, his reports are subject to censorship.
Israeli heavy artillery fired all through the day towards Beirut, but this evening there are reports that the firing has tapered off. Chief of Staff Raphael Eitan said tonight that the Israelis are in control of Beirut Airport, which is lying off under that pall of smoke about 3 miles from our camera position. The Israelis pounded the PLO strong points around the airport. They have also cut off the Damascus highway to the east, and they have linked up with the Christian forces. Eitan said the Israelis do not intend to take the city, but are determined to wipe out all PLO headquarters in the area. Tonight, Eitan said the PLO forces are on their knees begging for a ceasefire.
This is Pierre Salinger in Paris. ABC News has learned that the Israelis are in contact with the leadership of the PLO in West Beirut and have asked for the surrender of 10 top leaders of the Palestinian. In addition, the Israelis have called on the Palestinian army to put down its arms and to leave Beirut, to be transferred to prison camps. According to a top Palestinian source I reached in Beirut by telephone from Paris, the messages are being passed from the Israelis to the PLO through intermediaries at the American University in Beirut. In these messages, the Israelis have threatened to assault West Beirut, where Arafat and his command center are now trapped if their conditions are not met. But the PLO representative in London said the Palestinians are prepared to resist to the end.
Mr. Arafat will lead the battle until the victory or to die.
The fact is, the Palestinians do not believe the Israeli threat. They are so entrenched in West Beirut that they believe the Israelis would suffer massive losses if they entered the city. Thus, they are prepared to turn down the Israeli demands and resist to the death if the Israelis decide to attack. Pierre Salinger, ABC News, Paris.
International criticism of the Israeli occupation has not eased up, and today the French organization, Doctors Without Frontiers, said it was refused permission to set up an emergency hospital in Sidon. The medical team quoted an Israeli colonel as telling them, "If you work in the Lebanese hospital, we will send you out of the country." The French doctor in charge of the team said nearly 200 doctors in Sidon were ready to work, but they were not allowed to pick up the wounded.
Under all circumstances, the inherent right of self-defense.
Two-thirds of the United Nations boycotted Prime Minister Begin's defense of the Lebanon invasion. A lot of the world has begun to see Israel differently.
Israel was always that gallant little underdog democracy fighting for survival against all the odds. Now the Israelis have annexed East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, settled down more or less permanently on the West Bank, and occupied close to half of Lebanon. In the interests of self-defense, that gallant little underdog, Israel, has suddenly started behaving like the neighborhood bully.
Israel had its way here in South Lebanon against Washington's wishes and got what it wanted. From Beirut south to Israel's border, there is peace of sorts, a peace the United Nations force was never able to keep. The United Nothings, the Israelis call them. The roads are jammed with Israeli troops going back and forth from the front and Lebanese civilians just going back and forth, looking for some safety. The PLO is gone, but in the process, cities like Sidon, population 80,000, took a terrible beating from Israeli bombs and shells. A quarter of it was destroyed. The PLO had spread itself out among the population, so a lot of innocent people got in the way. Israel insists civilian dead were in the hundreds. The Red Cross says it was more like 9,000. Perhaps 250,000 are homeless. Nobody knows for sure. The Israelis killed more than 2,000 PLO fighters and captured thousands more. Another 6,000 they have bottled up in West Beirut, where the war goes on.
After the death,
Yasser Arafat told ABC News this week he will stay and fight to the last. Once in Jordan and now here, he has tried to make war against Israel from a country not his own. In this war, most of the Arab world left the PLO to fend for itself. And nobody knows what's to become of the 400,000 Palestinians in Lebanon who don't carry a gun. The war has turned many of them back into refugees. Israel will not want them next door, raising a new generation of guerrillas. And Palestinians, of course, don't have a home to go to. Prime Minister Begin and President Reagan have agreed they want a free and independent Lebanon, a sort of Mideast Finland. That's not likely to happen here. Lebanon has never been a country so much as a compromise, imperfect at that. Its 3 million people are an impossible jumble of race and language and religion. Israel would like its friends, the Lebanese Christians, to run the country, but they don't want to be seen as Israel's errand boys. Israel would like it even better if there were U.S. troops here to keep the peace, but Washington is not eager to send American boys to a place like this. Israel has promised to send its army home as soon as all's well in Lebanon, but that looks to be a very long time. In Sidon, at least, they were beginning to put things back together this week. The Lebanese are old hands at cleaning up after somebody else's war, and they're suddenly remembering they really didn't like the PLO anyway. As for Israel, it has never been more secure, and never quite so alone in the world. It has confounded its enemies, and it has commanded fear and respect. But it is not the Israel its first prime minister, Ben-Gurion, always imagined it would be. That Israel, that light unto the nations. Richard Threlkeld, ABC News in South Lebanon.
Tonight we have a special report from Geraldo Rivera, who has just returned from Lebanon, on the torment of the nation and the emergence of a leader determined to restore peace to his people.
As anyone who's seen the sights and listened to the sounds of war on their television sets for the last month knows very well, the Battle of Lebanon has been ferocious. The 3 foreign armies who fought and died here have decimated this hapless country. The big question for the Lebanese people, though, is what happens now, and whether or not they'll ever be able to rebuild this war-torn country. Will the fighting ever stop?
Definitely it will have to stop. Definitely that we are living now the last hours of the 8 years of war. Definitely we are starting now to think about the after war.
Bashir Gemayel, commanding general of the Christian Lebanese forces, has been fighting the Palestinians and the Syrians on and off since 1975. But it took the Israeli invasion to give his side a chance of victory.
We always kept saying that Lebanon is easy to eat, but very difficult to digest and almost impossible to digest. The Syrians and the Palestinians didn't understood all that. They kept playing tricks in Lebanon. They kept playing with the fire in Lebanon. We kept telling them, don't. They never understood, and here we are.
Until very recently, it was Gemayel who was never understood. When 2020 first interviewed him a year and a half ago, he was a political unknown outside his own country. A man with a cause virtually no international diplomat or news person even wanted to hear.
Until now, the U.S. public opinion don't know that we are fighting the same combat and the same fight for the same values and the same interests.
As the United States.
As the United States. And I think that this is why we were destroyed.
A year ago or less, American officials wouldn't even return your telephone calls. What have they discovered?
I feel, and I must say to be fair, that when we started to be organized, the US have started to understand us more and more. And the more united and the more organized we were, the more the US were giving us a more responsible ear, and they were listening more and more to what we had to say. You are right to say that a few months ago they will even not return my call. I must say that today it's basically a different situation.
The United States government, after years of pretending Gemayel did not exist, last year officially invited him to Washington. And America's newfound interest in Gemayel is not the only thing that's changed. The moderate Arab powers now apparently see him as Lebanon's last best chance. As commander of the tough 24,000-man Christian militia, 34-year-old Sheikh Bashir is perhaps the most potent homegrown military and political force left intact in his country. A leading candidate in Lebanon's presidential election, scheduled for later this summer, he is also one of the key figures in the kaleidoscope of personalities intensely seeking an end to the current bloodshed.
As far as we are concerned, we are looking for the liberation of our country. We are looking that all the foreigners out, Syrians, Palestinians, and Israelis, and even the UNIFIL country, as Lebanese, as a strong central government, as a strong central army, as once again the nation reunited, we will take care of the security of our own country. We don't need anybody in this country, and Arafat should understand that.
Is Israel your ally?
In politics, there is nothing permanent. You don't have permanent allies and permanent enemies. We are taking the maximum of advantage and benefit of the changement of the balance of power and equilibrium of power in the Lebanon.
The Lebanon is unique among nations in the region. Until the mid-70s, it was an important banking center and the playground of the Mideast. A rich, beautiful nation which for centuries performed a delicate balancing act between its diverse Christian and Muslim populations. Despite the almost continuous violence, there is a gritty determination among the Lebanese to maintain a bizarre sort of normalcy. Even now in East Beirut, you can see how citizens try to adjust. Traffic engineers, for instance, make allowances for tanks while business goes on. The beaches boom, while along the line separating Christian East from Muslim West Beirut, gunfire does not. Even at the height of the Israeli attack, there was less fighting between the Christians and their Syrian and PLO enemies than there was before last month's invasion. So despite the fact that his army has in part been trained and equipped by the Israelis, by not fighting alongside them, Gemayel is trying to demonstrate his independence.
Good evening. President Reagan said today he's lost patience with the continuing bloodshed in Lebanon, and he all but demanded that it stop, telling reporters he intends to make that point quite firmly with Israeli officials. The president's sharp and unusual show of exasperation came after a devastating 14-hour Israeli bombardment of West Beirut. At least 15 fires were set. Berber Hospital was hit, the city's international airport, and occupied it before another shaky ceasefire, the 9th, went into effect. We have two reports on the fighting, beginning with Hal Walker in Beirut.
The battle for Beirut today centered on the city's international airport to the south, where the Israelis made their most significant advances since laying siege to Palestinian-held West Beirut. Heavy artillery exchanges broke a 27-hour-long ceasefire in the pre-dawn hours. At first light, Israeli jets began their dive-bombing raids, tossing out flares to scramble and confuse heat-seeking missiles from the Palestinian guerrilla positions below. Wave after wave of the supersonic bombers came in over known and suspected Palestinian fighter emplacements. Their hits threw up great plumes of gray and black smoke which hung over the city. PLO and Syrian forces fought back with ferocity, taking deadly aim on the Israeli tank and gunnery positions. Some shells from the guerrillas in the west slammed into civilian neighborhoods in the Israeli-held east. Civilian casualties on both sides were high, though there is no official count yet of the dead and wounded. In West Beirut, hospitals are so taxed with the injured that they have become specialized. This center takes only burn victims of phosphorus shells. Shrapnel cases, concussions, and fractures are directed to other facilities. Palestinian sources claim the guerrillas shot down one Israeli plane and a helicopter gunship during the 14-hour battle. This could not be independently confirmed.
The military pressure from the Israeli side is relentless, but its effect on the negotiations over a Palestinian guerrilla evacuation from the city are far from clear. The PLO says it has given every concession it can and now demands that the Israelis pull back to allow the guerrillas to leave the city. Hal Walker, ABC News, West Beirut.
Some days ago, when Israel charged the PLO with stalling and not finalizing plans to evacuate Beirut, they may have been right. The PLO is an organization with many different opinions. More to the point, after all the Israeli pounding that Palestinian fighters have taken, Arafat needed time to convince his men on the front line they had helped win what Arafat is said to regard as a very significant political victory. The thesis, expounded by PLO political advisors, goes like this. The president's envoy, Philip Habib, may not talk directly to Yasser Arafat, but he puts to the Israelis the PLO point of view. Recognition, say Palestinians, they are equally important. The United States supports the organization of a multinational force, possibly including U.S. Marines, to protect Palestinian civilians from right-wing Christians after the PLO security cover is removed. And finally, it's Philip Habib who's been canvassing the Arab world in search of sanctuary for the PLO fighters and their leadership. Palestinians here find the situation ironic. Suddenly, it is not the Arab states, not the Soviet Union, but as they see it, the United States of America, which has become the guarantor of the PLO's political survival.
For 2 weeks, negotiations for a PLO withdrawal continue. But Yasser Arafat prolongs the talks in an effort to win concessions from the United States and Israel. Only after heavy Israeli aerial and artillery bombardments does the PLO agree to drop its demands and leave. An international peacekeeping force comprised of French, Italian, and American soldiers is sent to ensure their safe exit. 1 week later, Bashir Gemayel is elected president of Lebanon.
The Marine Amphibious Task Force, earmarked as the American unit to help in the evacuation of the PLO from Beirut, sailed from Naples, Italy this morning. It could be off the coast of Lebanon by Thursday night, where it will join the aircraft carrier USS Independence. Pentagon sources say the Marines have been ready for weeks, but negotiators in Beirut asked the military not to send the troops until most negotiating snags had been removed. Some 800 Marines are slated to go ashore in Beirut to secure that portion of the city for which the U.S. will be responsible. That will leave 1,000 Leathernecks on board ship as a backup. If there's trouble, another 1,600 Marines now at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, are to move in quickly. No American troops are to stay longer than 30 days. Government sources say there are stringent rules for American participation. For example, if fighting breaks out while the Marines are in Beirut, they will be withdrawn immediately. The U.S. will use what force is deemed necessary to get them out safely. Another condition, if the PLO does not fully cooperate with evacuation plans, again, U.S. troops will be pulled out immediately. And finally, the Marines will not provide food, water, or medical help to the people of Beirut. Sources say the soldiers are there to keep the peace, not to provide humanitarian relief. John McWethy, ABC News, the Pentagon.
In the Middle East today, more than 500 PLO guerrillas and 13 women and 5 children arrived in the Syrian port of Tartus. They were given a big welcome by Syrian officials and a large crowd as they disembarked. In Beirut, as more French and Italian troops arrived to help keep the peace, the departure of the PLO fighters continued, but not without some difficulty. Jim Hickey has this report.
500 Italian soldiers arrived here this morning to take over from the Palestinians the Gallery Saman checkpoint. That's along the line dividing East and West Beirut. But the Italian embassy says 28 guerrillas of a radical PLO faction have refused to leave in violation of the ceasefire agreement. And that, if not settled, could threaten the overland evacuation planned through here tomorrow. Earlier today, nearly 200 wounded PLO guerrillas were finally evacuated. Doctors here have complained that because hospital facilities are inadequate, these fighters, some of them badly burned, should have been moved the first day. UN sources indicate Israel, however, refused, fearing it would have a negative impact on world opinion. Emotions also ran high in a West Beirut assembly area where another 1,000 PLO fighters gathered for their evacuation. Soldiers from the Palestinian Liberation Army tried to prevent the usual firing of rifles into the air. Tempers flared. One young Palestinian had to be restrained from throwing a hand grenade into the crowd. Lebanese police say since Saturday, 9 people have been killed and scores wounded in these farewell salutes. At the port of Beirut, the send-off for today's group was festive. The evacuation of PLO guerrillas is now at the halfway point. 3,500 have left since it began. In East Beirut today, U.S. envoy Philip Habib met with Lebanon's president-elect Bashir Gemayel. In a 2020 interview with Geraldo Rivera to be seen later tonight, Gemayel, a Maronite Christian, said, with the PLO leaving his country, religious tensions are ending.
I think that we don't have any problem between Christians and Muslims in Lebanon. The real problem is the presence of all the foreign armed forces and all the foreign armed groups on the Lebanese soil who created all the problems.
But in West Beirut, Muslim leaders aren't so convinced and met today to develop strategy to deal with the Christian Gemayel. Jim Hickey, ABC News, West Beirut.
The U.S. Marines, all 800 of them, have now left Lebanon. They departed early this morning after serving as part of the international peacekeeping force to supervise the evacuation of the PLO. Bashir Gemayel, the newly elected president of Lebanon, has been assassinated. Gemayel, the leader of the Christian Phalangists, died after a bomb exploded in his party's headquarters.
Beirut awoke to thundering Israeli jets this morning. They flew low over the city again and again, the first time they've done that in 5 weeks. This time there were no bombs, but on the ground, Israeli soldiers, backed up by tanks, moved rapidly up the coastal road into West Beirut, blasting leftist militia positions with heavy fire. Israeli gunboats moved in close offshore to provide additional support. As they advanced, the Israelis ran into pockets of heavy resistance from Muslim militiamen. Down there, 2 militiamen provide cover as the fallen body of another is retrieved. By mid-afternoon, Israeli troops reportedly had advanced nearly 2 miles beyond the ceasefire line, their deepest penetration into West Beirut since the June 6th invasion. Meanwhile, the number of dead and injured in yesterday's explosion, which killed President-elect Bashir Gemayel, has reportedly reached at least 60. No one yet has claimed responsibility for the bombing. Lebanon has begun 7 days of mourning for Gemayel. Shops were closed. Usually crowded streets were nearly empty. He was buried in his hometown mountain village of Bekraya this afternoon. Among those attending was U.S. Presidential Envoy Morris Draper, who has returned to the Middle East to continue peace talks. The funeral was a mixture of solemn procession and ritual dancing in Gemayel's honor. But the despair may be as much for Lebanon as it is. Though a man with many enemies, he was generally considered the best hope for peace here. Even his strongest Muslim opponents called Gemayel's murder a painful blow to Lebanon, a barbarian crime. The problem is, always murky future is now shattered. Half the people in this country, said one leader, are in mourning. The other half are in terror. Jim Hickey, ABC News, Beirut.
The spotlight in Lebanon has shifted rapidly once again from the death of Lebanon's president-elect Bashir Gemayel to what the Israelis have done here in Beirut today. What they have done is invade and occupy West Beirut, where the majority of the city's population lives. Tonight there was still fighting between the Israelis and the leftist militias. Some of it sporadically throughout the day has been severe. This is an Israeli field hospital set up on the edge of West Beirut. It is difficult to assess the casualties. Tonight the Israelis are refusing to give statistics until next of kin are notified. The Israelis say they're intent on preventing civil war in the wake of Bashir Gemayel's death. What they have done is attack the Muslim and leftist militias in the West, which oppose the Israelis' right-wing Christian allies.
Good evening. Gunmen have marauded through 2 Palestinian refugee camps in West Beirut, executing unarmed men, women, and children in a bloody massacre which has heightened tensions between the U.S. and Israel. Responsibility still has not been fixed, nor has the exact death toll, but witnesses believe hundreds of Palestinian civilians are dead. We have 2 reports. First, Mike McCourt in Beirut, and we must warn you the pictures are very disturbing.
Beirut was a city of firing squads last night, of executions carried out against Palestinian civilians in their refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila. No one knows for sure who did this. No one knows who came to Sabra and Shatila and shot everyone they could find. But there are people in Beirut who say it was bound to happen, that the factional and religious warfare of this city's recent past would erupt once again. Except this was not warfare. Children do not carry guns, and they offer no offense except in this case to hold the wrong birthright. There are some who say the right-wing Phalange militia did this after the Israelis secured the camps and moved on. Those who escaped or were not there last night might have had their own ideas about who was responsible. But as they wept for their husbands and children, they would have had more trouble answering the question, why?
This is Ann Compton. At the White House, reaction was angry and impatient. Secretary of State Schultz emerged after hours in the Situation Room.
We have been, of course, following this terrible tragedy in Beirut.
Secretary Schultz helped President Reagan draft a statement that virtually blames Israel. I was horrified to learn of the killing, the president said, describing our outrage and revulsion over the murders, which included women and children.
Israel's response to the criticism its government has received came after an emergency session of the cabinet that ended after midnight. The word from Prime Minister Begin, Israel refuses to accept any blame for the massacre in Beirut.
All the direct or implicit accusations that the IDF bear any blame whatsoever for this human tragedy in the Shatila camp are entirely baseless and without any foundation. The government of Israel rejects them with a contempt which they deserve.
Meridor reiterated the Israeli claims that the bloodshed would have been worse had Israeli troops not been in West Beirut, and that the PLO and not the Israelis violated the ceasefire agreement. But the statement leaves several questions unanswered. First, it makes no reference to the massacre at the Sabra camp, only the one at Shatila. Second, the statement says nothing about why the Israeli army allowed the right-wing Christian phalange into the Palestinian camps unescorted. And third, there has still been no official Israeli response to President Reagan's call for an immediate Israeli withdrawal from Beirut. Thousands of Israelis demonstrated against the government across the country, pinning the blame for the massacre squarely on Mr. Begin. These groups have always been a minority in Israel, but tonight that minority may be turning into a majority. Josh Mankiewicz, ABC News, Jerusalem.
Good evening. The Marines are going back to Lebanon. This time to stay until the Lebanese themselves can control their own country and prevent the kind of massacre that so sickened and stunned the world this past weekend. ABC News has learned that the CIA now estimates that when and if all the bodies are counted, the death toll will exceed 1,000.
Overseas today, the Israeli defense minister has been talking about the massacre of Palestinians last month in Beirut. Ariel Sharon has been central to the storm of protest which followed the killings inside Israel and out. As ABC's Bill Siemens reports from Jerusalem, during 6 hours of testimony, Sharon told an Israeli investigating commission the decision to let the Lebanese Phalange militia into the refugee camps was his.
Defense Minister Sharon asked that this morning's hearing be open to news coverage because he said he had nothing to hide. And in the hearing room, he faced the three-man commission, all of whom hammered away at the key question, who made the decision to send the Christian Phalange troops into the Palestinian camps? Sharon said that the cabinet, 3 months before, had decided that the Lebanese forces should become more involved in the fighting. That was the key political decision. Sharon said that to save Israeli lives, he decided on the 15th of September, with Chief of Staff Raphael Eitan, to send the Phalange into the camps to root out PLO holdouts. Sharon, I approved it because it was the acceptable thing, a clear thing. It was something we wanted for a long time. Question. Was the decision a political or military issue? Sharon, it was a military realization of the political decision taken earlier. Question, did Prime Minister Begin know about the decision? Sharon, no. No, to the best of my knowledge, no. Sharon said he first learned about the killings on Friday night, September 17th, 24 hours after the Phalange entered the camps. He ordered them out by 5 a.m. Saturday morning, but could not reach Prime Minister Begin to inform him of the massacre because Begin was attending services in a synagogue. Begin found out listening to radio news Saturday evening. Did Sharon not suspect that the Phalange might seek revenge for Bashir Gemayel's assassination? Sharon, it never crossed my mind that it would happen.
Good evening. I'm Frank Reynolds, and this is World News Tonight. It happened in mid-September, the massacre of Palestinians by Christian phalangists in Beirut refugee camps. On October 1st, an Israeli commission of inquiry was formed to find out why and how it was allowed to happen. Now the commission has released its report. With the full story, here is Peter Jennings reporting tonight from Israel.
Frank, those cynics outside Israel who suggested this commission report will be a whitewash have been proved very wrong. Many Israelis are surprised how tough the report is, condemning, as it does, pillars of the Israeli establishment. Some highlights. The commission recommends that Ariel Sharon, the defense minister, be fired if he does not resign, that the director of military intelligence, Yehoshua Sagi, should be dismissed immediately, Prime Minister Begin is accused of showing no interest whatsoever in what the Christian militias were doing inside the Palestinian camps after he knew they were there.
On September 15, 1983, 1 year after the Sabra and Shatila massacres, Menachem Begin resigned. Israel's occupation of Lebanon continued. The PLO set up headquarters in exile. The U.S. Marines stayed in Beirut on a peacekeeping mission. But on October 23, 1983, a suicide truck bomb exploded in the Marine barracks, killing 241 American servicemen. 4 months later, the Marines withdrew. 3 years after the invasion began, Israel withdrew from Lebanon.
In the next couple of days, the Israeli army will take another major step away from the fighting that has embroiled Israel in Lebanon for so long. As the Israelis prepare to move the great bulk of their forces back across the Israeli-Lebanese border, ABC's Bob Zelnick reports on what their Lebanese adventure has cost them.
Some came out to flowers and champagne. Some were greeted with song. More than 650 came home to the mournful prayer for the dead. And from the bereaved to the dead, the only gift that matters, assurance that the sacrifice was not in vain.
Every family has to do what is good for Israel, not for themselves first.
What is good for Israel was very much in the minds of the men who stormed into Lebanon 3 years ago. They went to dislodge the PLO from its base of operations in the south, to bring peace to northern Galilee.
Israel was not defeated in this war. The PLO terrorist organization were completely defeated, and they do not exist as PLO terrorist organization anymore.
True enough, but scenes like this, the massive bombing of Beirut, affected Israelis' sense of proportion.
One of the lessons of this war is there's certainly a limitation to the use of force.
Israel tried to expel Syria from Lebanon, but the Syrians, defeated on the battlefield, never left. Today, they are the dominant force in Lebanese affairs. The massacre of Palestinians at Sabra and Shatila by Israel's Christian ally triggered the first massive anti-war demonstration in this country's history.
What is terribly important, I believe, for all democratic countries is to maintain as much as you can a national consensus on matters of life and death. I think the war of Lebanon broke our national consensus.
Pulling back from Beirut, Israel maintained occupation forces throughout South Lebanon. The result, a prolonged and brutal clash with the area's Shiites, sapping the morale of Israel's proud, largely reservist army.
We managed to turn friendly people against Israel by occupying them and degrading them in exactly the same way that things are done in the West Bank.
Keeping Israeli troops in Lebanon has also been costly in financial terms, contributing to the country's rampaging inflation. At some sacrifice to preparedness, the Israeli army has been asked to accept cuts in equipment and personnel. The war has brought northern Galilee 3 years of quiet, but many residents fear it will not last.
It's a very paradoxical situation. The forces are coming back, and yet the anxiety is now what will happen, because there's no peace.
The Israelis retain a so-called security zone running 5 to 12 miles on the Lebanese side of the border. But the range of Katyusha rockets is 25 miles, leaving northern communities vulnerable to attack. A ditch running the entire length of the border serves as a barrier to car bombs. An electrified fence is one more buffer. But the Israelis have warned residents that if terror returns, they'll be back in force.
They will be the first to suffer. Their homes will be blown up. They will not be able to live in their villages, and they'll have to run away.